original land. And as a Palestinian, it's extremely important for me and for us to keep highlighting all the forms and shapes in which settler colonialism continues to impact colonized people and colonized land. My name's Noura, and we're meeting here today as we enter almost over 2 months of Israeli aggression and attacks on our people in Gaza. For the last 2 months, since October 7th, Israel has massacred over 18,000 Palestinians, 70% of whom are children and women. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, markets, libraries, you name it. No one is spared, no one is safe, and no place is safe in Gaza. Sadly, Samah could not make it tonight for personal reasons. She is unwell, so she's a last-minute apology. But what we will do tonight is that we'll be in conversation with Miko. I'll ask a few questions, and then towards the end we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. When that stage comes, I would like to ask you to keep your questions short, concise, and just not because I don't like to listen to analysis and essays and PhD dissertations, I do, but just trying to make sure everyone gets to contribute and participate, and so that we make it as engaging as possible for folks here. Right, so without any further ado, allow me to introduce our guest. Miko Peled is an Israeli-American anti-Zionist peace activist, author, and karate instructor. Miko's considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice for Palestine. Miko is also a contributor to several online publications and has been invited to speak all over the world. Wherever he's speaking, Miko dedicates the opportunity to advocate for the creation of one democratic state with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. He travels regularly to Palestine, where he speaks and works with the BDS movement and other justice groups. So welcome and thank you, Miko, for being here tonight. Miko, the 7th of October has been categorized by many as a turning point, as a pivotal historical moment. I guess my first question would be, what implications this day has for Israelis and Palestinians? Obviously, we know how it's been working for Palestinians, but more specifically, what implications does it have for the Israeli politics, and how would that also translate in terms of the Palestinians inside and outside of Israel in 1948?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the invitation to be here in Melbourne. It's a pleasure to be here once again after I was here in 2011. And it's good to see so many people gather wanting to talk about Palestine. It's always very encouraging, especially when we're so far away, in a place so distant, and still there's such a sincere desire to learn and to talk and to participate in the conversation about Palestine. And thank you for the introduction and for doing this with me. October the 7th, for anyone who's involved in the issue of Palestine, October the 7th is one of those dates that we will always remember exactly where we were when we heard about this. And it was a watershed moment, there's no question. Now, what actually happened was a group of fighters from one of the poorest and most oppressed regions in the world flew in on gliders, came by sea on small vessels and walked across the prison fence and were able to occupy almost half of Palestine. 22 Israeli cities and settlements were taken by these fighters. The military base of the Gaza Brigade, which was supposed to prevent that from ever happening, was taken. I've heard, although there's no confirmation, that the commanding general was taken. And basically this group of fighters from, once again, I'll say, one of the poorest and most oppressed areas in the world, was able to completely paralyze the state of Israel. The Israeli military was nowhere to be found. The Israeli intelligence was nowhere to be found. Israelis were in a state of shock. This country that everybody hails as a great, miracle, a great democracy, a functioning country, was completely paralyzed by this group of fighters. And it took the Israeli military, this, over-glamorized terrorist organization, which is probably, like I said before, one of the best equipped and best financed terrorist organizations in the world. It took them weeks before they were able to take the fighting back into the Gaza Strip. And as we know, they're still fighting and suffering heavy casualties. And I think it's important to remember that Palestinians have never had an army. Palestinians have never had a military force. There's never been a Palestinian tank or warplane, much less. So this was unprecedented. On top of that, I don't think it was by chance that this happened exactly 50 years and 1 day after the 1973 attack, which started the 1973 October War. And once again, we saw, and again, this is not the first time, once again we saw that the Israeli military is basically a paper tiger. Whenever it's challenged, it falls apart. The Israeli intelligence apparatus, which everybody admires as a great intelligence apparatus, failed miserably. And then what happened was the state of Israel and the Israeli army, which were so severely humiliated, embarked on a massive campaign of vengeance. Like a bully or a gangster that is humiliated, they found the weakest, most defenseless people on earth to take out their revenge. And you said some 18,000. What I heard is the conservative estimate for the number of Palestinian civilians who have been brutally murdered over these last couple of months exceeds 20,000, and that's a conservative estimate. People are expecting that once all the missing will be found and all the people who are buried under the rubble are going to die these horrific deaths, it'll exceed 50,000. So this is unprecedented. Even for the cruelty and brutality of Israel, this is unprecedented. And what we've seen is a lot of unprecedented things. I'm going to be using this word a lot. Incredible courage by the Palestinians, incredible capabilities by the Palestinians, and it's interesting because in the first few days, even Israeli generals were praising the Palestinian ability, the Palestinians' ability to do what they did. And again, we have to remember, we're not talking about soldiers. We're talking about people, if they get one meal a day, that's good. They don't have supply lines like an army would, certainly not like Israel has. And so this was really quite a remarkable achievement. And then, of course, we see Israel's response, this brutal savagery, which has been unprecedented even for Israel. Now, like I said, this was a watershed moment, and I think it presented, and still perhaps presents, a unique opportunity, something we have never seen before. And that opportunity is for the international community to demand, in no uncertain terms, guarantees for the safety and security of the Palestinian people. Palestinians, like you said correctly, have no place that they're safe. There's no place in Palestine where Palestinians are safe. This is not new. Palestinians have been living under a reign of terror for 75 years. Bombs and destruction have been raining on people who live in the Gaza Strip for decades. This is nothing new, but the level is unprecedented. So this is an opportunity for the international community to step in and say, enough. Palestinians have paid way above what should be considered a high enough price, and it's time to demand everything the Palestinians deserve. Safety and security must be guaranteed. Money must be coming in order to help them rebuild and rehabilitate. Massive sanctions must be imposed on the state of Israel. A no-fly zone must be imposed over Gaza. And the apartheid regime, steps must be taken to begin the dismantling of the apartheid state and replacing it with a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. This is the time to do it. This is the time. I mean, the time to do this was a long time ago, before these 20, 30, 40,000 innocent men, women, and children were murdered. But now, this is not a time to negotiate. This is not a time to ask. This is a time to demand. This is a time to stand up in a way and make demands in no uncertain terms. Palestinian freedom, the dismantlement of apartheid, and rebuilding as much as possible and giving Palestinians everything they need in order to recuperate from this catastrophe. So I believe that even now, and another interesting thing is, of course, that even as the bodies are piling up by the tens of thousands, we've been used to seeing thousands murdered in Gaza in previous attacks by Israel, but we're talking about tens of thousands now. And as the bodies continue to pile up, the Israeli army has still not been able to defeat the Palestinian fighters, and they're having massive losses. Officers, all their special forces, and all their glamorized, little terror squads are being killed by the Palestinians, who, again, I will say, are not an actually regular army, do not have the supply lines, the logistics, the resources that an army has. And so this should give every single person a moment to pause and say, we have to make sure whatever is demanded now has to include the absolute guarantee that this will never happen again, that no Palestinian will ever be in danger like this again. And this, of course, falls on us. So that's what I believe October the 7th is all about.
Thanks for that, Miko. So yesterday we saw the United Nations pass a motion for a ceasefire by a vast majority. Obviously, those countries who opposed are Israel and the United States. Yet we hear from Israeli officials that they will continue until they achieve their objectives. The objectives of this onslaught have been twofold, at least according to the ones that have been declared by Israeli officials. First one is returning of the hostages, and then the second one is elimination or extermination of Hamas. I guess what would that mean, and what would that look like in terms of returning of hostages, but also eliminating Hamas? And how has it been? You touched on it briefly, that on the ground it's not really going well for the Israeli soldiers, as they are faced with fierce resistance from these armed groups. But I guess what would that mean in terms of a timeline, but also what is eliminating Hamas?
Well, I don't believe that Israel has an objective. The only objective Israel has is vengeance. And this actually is working very well within internal Israeli politics, because this is exactly what Israelis have been demanding for a very long time. So the government is doing exactly what their constituents want them to do. And so I don't believe there's any objective, really, not a military or political objective to Israel. It's vengeance and desire to kill as many as possible. If they want to eliminate Hamas, if they want to eliminate Palestinian resistance, I think there's a very clear pathway to doing that. That would include, like I said, dismantling the apartheid state, allowing Palestinians to return to their homes, and as the beginning the transition from apartheid to a free democratic Palestine with equal rights. This is how resistance stops, by ending the oppression, ending the occupation, and ending the killing. If anybody, I don't believe anybody thinks this seriously, although they claim it, but it's ridiculous to expect that a military operation could possibly bring down the Palestinian resistance. It's not going to happen. I don't believe anybody believes it's going to happen, but again, they have to say this, and because the Israeli government's constituents are demanding it, the fighting and the killing will continue. So I think the pathway to ending the fighting is very clear. It's just that Israel does not want that. And the international community, for reasons that we can touch on later perhaps, the international community is completely has forsaken the Palestinians. They're allowing Israel to continue with this unbelievable brutality, and they're saying, and the United States is sending them more weapons. As far as the United Nations, Israel never cared about the United Nations, and there's no reason for Israel to care about the United Nations today. The United Nations has no means of enforcement. Now, if the United States and the international community wanted to stop, the United States Navy's Sixth Fleet is in the Mediterranean. They can bring these warships to force Israel to stop. They can bring the Sixth Fleet and start helping people in Gaza. They can enforce the no-fly zone and severe sanctions. They can do this tomorrow if they're serious about this. But they're not serious about this, and that's why they're passing one resolution after another. They're vetoed, they're not vetoed. It makes absolutely no sense, no difference, because they're not enforcing it. And again, Israel never cared about what the UN did or didn't do. So this is so far below what is required. And the ongoing talk of a ceasefire is a joke, because Israel doesn't have to stop, and Israel has always violated ceasefires. What is required is a much, much greater effort to end the violence against Palestinians.
Thanks for that. I think, so, yes, obviously genocide is the strategy, but it's also the goal, so there is no clear objective aside than eliminating the indigenous population of Gaza, obviously, the over 2 million Palestinian people. And obviously that's not by itself, it's not a new development. It's a part of an ongoing policies and strategies, and that we've seen for the last, at least 17 years in Gaza, but also over 75 years in Palestine, across the historic Palestine. I guess maybe we could talk a little bit more about the United Nations, the international community, and we saw what the international community can do if it's serious about accountability in the case of Ukraine. Like, everyone knew exactly what to do. People withdrew their officials. There was sanctions imposed. Again, you mentioned no-fly zone on Gaza, but how likely for that to actually occur, and what kind of pressure do maybe, I guess, actors on the international level, but also maybe civil society organizations, like people, like us, what is it that we need to do to help bring that closer to reality and, to achieve that kind of...
Well, I think we have to recognize that the Palestinians and the entire Palestinian issue are orphans. There's nobody taking care of the Palestinians, and nobody stands for Palestinians. There's no state, there's no group of states, there's no international organization. Nobody is protecting the Palestinians. Nobody speaks for the Palestinians. If we compare it, for example, to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, you had the ANC, which was a formidable organization. You had the South African Communist Party, you had the Soviet bloc, you had Cuba sending tanks to Angola to defeat the apartheid state, and so on. So I mean, the black South Africans had allies. Palestinians had nothing. And probably one of Israel's biggest achievements and biggest successes is the Oslo Accords, because the Oslo Accord neutralized the countries that supported Palestinians or the Palestinian cause. And so when people say, oh, Oslo failed, Oslo didn't fail. Oslo was a spectacular success for Israel. And I believe that what we're seeing today is a direct result of that. But we need to recognize our weakness before we can do anything. And when we look at the other side, the Zionists have had a very well financed, strategic plan to do what they're doing. They've been doing this for over 100 years, long before the State of Israel was established. And there's never been a counter. There's never been anything even remotely similar to what the Zionists have been doing. And of course, when Israel was established, the State of Israel has been doing in terms of PR, in terms of presenting their case. So if you are an American politician, an Australian politician, and you want to make an informed decision, you don't have the tools to do that. Because one side presents a very compelling story, a very compelling case, and they push this case forward very, very, very strongly, very aggressively. And on the other side, there are some activists doing a little bit of work here and there, and nobody can compete. And so I don't think that we can make a difference until such time that something like this is created. You know, we live in democracies where we vote for our elected officials. Well, why are we voting for elected officials who support Israel? And how do we use the power that we have in the ballot box and as consumers of the press in bringing about that change? That is the big question. And without a clear strategy, without a real playbook that helps people deal with this, and people always ask, well, how do I respond when they say this, and how do I respond when they say that? Because they're very good at putting people on our side on the defensive. Do you condemn this? Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? You know, that's not how you conduct a conversation. They push bumper stickers, they push slogans, and then they expect us to somehow respond. So it takes training, it takes time, it takes somebody to do this, and there's nobody doing it. There's nobody doing it because, again, there's no parent for Palestinians, and there's no parent for the Palestinian cause, and that is a very, very serious problem. I've been talking to some friends here about an initiative that I'm involved in Washington, D.C., putting together precisely that kind of an organization, that kind of Palestinian presence in Washington, D.C., which is where, at the end of the day, things need to change so that things change everywhere else. But we need to recognize this weakness, and we have to work within that. I don't know that we have the capability right now to actually do anything other than get together and speak and so on. We don't really have, there's a huge gap between public opinion and what happens in the halls of power. And it's true here, and it's true in Europe, and it's true in the United States, it's true everywhere. And the same goes for the press. You know, there's no representation in the press for the massive support that Palestinians have, on the street and in places around the world, including here. And that is a serious problem. So I think once we recognize that and we start working towards that, then we will begin to see change. But it is a massively difficult project, a massively difficult thing that we need to do.
I think you touched on a really important point, the fact that there's the lack of political or proper political representation for the Palestinians is an issue. But also on the other side, you mentioned that the last couple of months have presented an opportunity, and I think this is something that is quite interesting because when we talk about Palestine, recently we're hearing a lot about the resurrection of the two-state solution discourse by officials. It's coming back really strongly. I mean, the Australian government has always held that position that it's like a talking point, right? Blah blah blah, and then two-state solution. No one really knows what that means. No one knows what that would look like. If that's even viable, but that's not a concern. No one's really actually interested in implementing any two-state solution or any solution for the Palestinians. So I would say, why would you think? Why is it that it's back in this kind of intensity at this stage, specifically a solution? And you also mentioned Oslo and how it's actually been a success for Israel, and obviously two-state solution is also tied.
Yeah, well, the two-state solution is what people say when they don't want to tell the truth. And so they fall back on a two-state solution knowing that it's very safe because it's never going to happen. I I frankly really don't know what the virtues of the two-state solution are, and I don't understand why the two-state solution is a good solution. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. Some of you, know I've read my book, The General Son, Journey of Israel in Palestine. And in the book, I talk about several things that have to do with my father, who was the general. And I'll tell you two things that are in the book that have to do with my father. When he was a young lieutenant colonel in the 1950s, he spoke in front of an audience of wealthy Jewish donors and important members of the Israeli cabinet. And he said, and this is mentioned in the memoirs of Israel's prime minister at the time, and he said that the Israeli army is prepared and ready for the order to push the eastern boundaries of the state of Israel to their natural place, which is the Jordan River. This is the mid-early 1950s. In other words, to take the West Bank. So he said, we're ready, we're expecting this, we know that these are the natural boundaries of our state, and we're just waiting for the governments to give us the order. Well, in 1967, they actually did it without the order, but that's another story. The Israeli army took the West Bank and pushed the Israeli boundaries to where they thought it should be, and they called it finishing the job because they believed that in 1948, they should have taken more, but then for whatever reasons they didn't. So then they created these two areas, one called the West Bank, one called the Gaza Strip, which Israelis drew, by the way. Israelis drew them. And today they're treated like they've been there forever. On the last day of the 1967 war, and again, calling it a war I think is a bit of a, I don't think it's the right way to describe what happened in 1967. It was a brutal assault by Israel against its neighbors for the sake of taking land. And it wasn't a 6-day war, it was actually a 5-day war. And why was it called a 6-day war? Anybody want to guess? The 6 days of creation was a miracle. And in the Israeli prayer book, 6 days, if you look at the Israeli prayer book, the term 6 days, 6 days, 6 days shows up a lot as the miracle of creation. They wanted to tie what happened in 1967 to the 6 days of creation as though it was a miracle. And even to this day, people who don't believe in God or in miracles say that that was a miracle. And why, I'm really not sure. There was no miracle. It was a brutal assault by a very well-trained, well-prepared army against Israel, the neighbors of the state of Israel. And I don't know if you know this is kind of a side, but at the end of those 5 days, the Arab armies suffered 18,000 casualties. 18,000 Arab soldiers were killed. Israel suffered 700 casualties. So I think the difference shows. Now everybody that dies has a mother and a father, and we hope that nobody has this to go through that as a parent, but that just to show what actually took place. But anyway, on the 5th day the last day of the war, the Israeli military high command met, and my father, of course, was still in uniform. He was one of the generals who planned and executed that assault. But he stood up and he said something very interesting. He stood up and he said, I know some of you know this because you read the book, but he stood up and he said, we now have an opportunity to make peace with our neighbors. We can allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza, the newly occupied territories. We can return the Sinai to the Egyptians, the Golan Heights to the Syrians. We can make peace with all of our neighbors and move on. Because now the accomplishments of 1948 are secure. And we can have a Jewish state, there'll be a little Palestinian state, so Palestinians can enjoy their own right to self-determination, and we can move on. And two things happened while he was saying this. The first one is Israeli bulldozers were destroying neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, which had just been taken, destroying villages and towns in the newly acquired territories in the West Bank, forcing into exile hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from those areas, and massively building for Jews only in those territories. This happened immediately as his words were being said, on the 5th, as the war ended. The other thing that happened is that his comrades in arms, Yitzhak Rabin and all these generals who were involved in that, took him aside and said, what in the world, what the hell are you talking about? What the hell are you talking about? We just finished the job in 1948, now you're telling us that you want to give it back? And it didn't make any sense. Now he retired from the military about a year later, and the rest of his life he spent promoting this idea of a two-state solution, which became less and less and less and less possible because the state of Israel wanted to make sure that that would never happen. To the point where there is no West Bank. West Bank is just still in our imagination and in some old maps, but there's no West Bank. It's completely integrated into Israel. You may have heard that area is now called Judea and Samaria. And the one distinction that exists in those areas is the way Israel describes it. There are pockets of alien population. Pockets of alien population. Pockets, 3.5 million people living in ghettos. And they are the alien population, not the settlers, not the Israeli settlers. The Palestinians are the alien population. So when people ask me today about the two-state solution, I do exactly what you said. Well, tell me how it's going to work. And that's when they take out the rope, they wrap it around their neck, and they hang themselves. Because there's no way to explain it. And there are no virtues to the two-state solution anyway. What are the virtues of a two-state solution? And why should the Palestinians accept a smaller part? Maybe Israel should, the Jewish state should be in the West Bank and Gaza, and the rest of Palestine should be for Palestinians. Who said that this should be that this is somehow a correct division? Why should Palestinians agree to this absurd so-called solution? It's absurd. And today they say, oh, the problem with Hamas is they don't accept the two-state solution. The problem with this person, he doesn't accept the two-state solution. The problem is the Palestinians don't accept it. Not that Israel made it impossible. The problem is that the Palestinians don't accept it. It's no longer there. It existed as a possibility for maybe 5 minutes historically. And Israel made sure. Now, Israel established a single state from the river to the sea with privilege only for Israeli Jews. Who are the minority of the population between the river and the sea. Is it allowed to say river and the sea, by the way?
Yeah.
So Israel established a single state, an apartheid state, a violent, brutal apartheid regime from the river to the sea for the minority Jewish population of settlers. When Palestinians call for a free democratic Palestine with equal rights from the river to the sea, that's the problem. Why does this make sense? Why do people even accept this? When Palestinians say it's hate speech, when Israelis are calling for apartheid, racism, and violence by the minority, that's somehow okay. That's somehow, acceptable. So again, it's one of these, certainly, I'm sure the Australian government and other Western governments, and even beyond the West, the BRICS countries are not much better than that. The Africans are not much better than that. They all talk about the two-state solution because they don't want to make a choice. You have to make a choice. Apartheid or freedom and democracy. But when you make that choice, it's very clear that the state of Israel, which is the name that was given to the apartheid state that took over Palestine, must be dismantled. And that a free democratic Palestine is the only way, the only path that can lead to a peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Nobody wants to say that. But this is precisely what needs to be said. And this is precisely, I believe, the way this needs to be framed. It's not Israelis versus the Palestinians, because one solution will lead to peace and to the benefit of both Israelis and Palestinians. And the other solution is a racist, violent solution. It's not about Israelis versus Palestinians. It's about racism and violence versus freedom and democracy. And that's how it should be framed. So why they fall back on a two-state solution? Because it's easy. And it's the only thing they're willing to talk about. And even that is considered extreme today.
Israeli public opinion has been also very clear in the sense that it's anti-two-state solution, as well as we've continuously heard comments from Israeli politicians that especially the ones who are currently in power, that they obviously there will never be a state, a Palestinian state, alongside a Jewish state. But then recently we also heard 2 days ago Benjamin Netanyahu kind of insinuating, or saying, actually not insinuating, just clearly saying that Israel is ready for a war against Palestinian Authority as well. So how does that all play in the kind of broader picture of what is Netanyahu's strategy? And obviously Netanyahu, as you know, it's quite known for everyone, is struggling in terms of domestic politics, but also with all the corruption allegations that could land him in prison. But how is opening another front, which I mean, it's currently ongoing as well, and that's where I guess I want to kind of also maybe direct the discussion a little bit around what's happening in the West Bank and in Jenin. And what would that look like for Netanyahu to kind of also wage war on the Palestinian Authority or Palestinian forces?
Benjamin Netanyahu has only one strategy. He has only one objective, and that's to keep his backside in the chair. That's it. He will do anything to keep his backside in the Prime Minister's chair. That's the only strategy, that's the only objective he has, and he will do anything he needs to do that. And to be quite honest, he's done a very good job. I think his backside is perfectly safe. Israeli public opinion is very easy to, if people want to know what Israelis think, just look at the makeup of the Israeli Knesset, of the Israeli parliament. That's what Israelis think. Look at the makeup of the Israeli cabinet, the Israeli government. That's what Israelis think. Israelis voted for them over and over and over again, many, many times. So it's very obvious what Israelis want. And whenever there is Palestinian bloodshed, Israelis seem to be perfectly happy. And they give the full throated support to the government. You remember, I'm sure, that a few months ago, or until a few months ago, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were in the streets protesting against Netanyahu. They didn't go anywhere because they were all the people that didn't vote for him, and he has a secure majority in the Knesset, so it didn't matter. But there was something very interesting that happened at one point, and it had to do with the Israeli Air Force pilots. So Israeli Air Force pilots have to maintain, the reservists have to maintain their training, weekly training. It's a very rigorous regimen. They have to be very well trained because they might be called on very quickly to drop millions of tons of bombs on a defenseless population in Gaza or to bomb targets in Syria and so on. So they have to prepare, and they're happy and willing to do that. When the protests against Netanyahu were taking place, several Air Force pilots said they will not go for the training because they are going to the protests. And democracy is more important than even the training. Where are they now? Where are they now? Israeli Air Force pilots are considered in Israeli society to be the gods, the cream of the crop. Everybody adores them, and they adore themselves. Where are they now? They have no problem whatsoever. They have no problem whatsoever. I haven't heard any of them say, no, we're not going to do this. They're lining up. So there is no clear objective other than maintaining the violence. And Israel made it very, very clear very early on, in the 1950s, that peace is not an objective. It's never been an objective. The only objective is always making sure that they are the best armed bully in the neighborhood. That's it. And that they kill more Arabs than Arabs can kill of them. That's it. And to that end, you have to say they've done a very good job. But this continues to be the case. This continues to be the case. That has never changed. I don't think this particular government is any more extreme than any other government that Israel has had. I mean, Israel's first government conducted the ethnic cleansing in 1948. How much more extreme can these people be? So I don't believe that there's been any shift whatsoever. It's been a continuous, persistent moving forward with the same objective. So, killing Palestinians, terrorizing countries around Palestine is what Israel does, and they do it all the time. And of course, that's why I said earlier, the most important thing to do now, and again, we're late, we're about 20,000 innocent civilians late, is to make sure there's pressure to guarantee the safety and the lives of Palestinians. The security and the safety and the lives of Palestinians must be the absolute first objective, and a ceasefire is not going to do it. A demand for a ceasefire is not going to guarantee anything. Not even a long-standing ceasefire or a permanent. There's no such thing as a permanent ceasefire. We're dealing with Israel. There's no such thing as a permanent ceasefire. The only permanent ceasefire will be when Israel is dismantled and replaced with a real democracy with equal rights. So it's really important not to be kind of, pulled into this confusion of Israeli politics, the confusion of the kind of the rhetoric and about what is happening right now. Are they going to bring somebody else to take care of Gaza? Will Hamas be destroyed? Will the PA be this and that? That's not what's important right now. It's important not to be pulled into that conversation, but be absolutely clear that the one demand that has to be consistent is the safety and security of Palestinians, period, long term and forever. This must never be allowed to happen again, ever. And the only way to do that is, like I said, sanctions and so on to dismantle the apartheid state. That's it. Don't talk about anything, any of the ceasefire, two-state solution, peace with Israel. There's no such thing. There is no such thing. The welfare of Palestinian children from the river to the sea and beyond, and the refugees in camps outside of Palestine, must be our first objective. Their safety. Nothing is more important than that. Nothing should get in the way of that conversation. Nothing should, distract us from that. There should be no distractions allowed. The safety of Palestinian children, of Palestinian men and women, and the elderly, and so on, must be the only objective. And to that end, we have to make the toughest demands possible, the biggest demands possible. And then we can see a movement forward. What happens is Israeli politics isn't about Netanyahu, who cares?
Thank you for that. Palestinians have always experienced Israel as an expansionist and exclusionist project, in the sense that it cannot live with others who are non-Zionists. But specifically, clearly, we're talking about Palestinians. So it has been consistent in that sense with all of its policies and practices and all of its operations to kind of achieve that goal. But also at the same time, we've also seen consistency from the Palestinians in the sense that relentless, sumud, and the way that the Palestinians have been able to kind of continuously evolve and reshape the struggle, but also the resistance has also been something that Israel, clearly 75 years later, it's unable to complete its project. So we know that the Zionist project is not complete, and that is because of the sumud of the Palestinian people. So I think I just wanted to make that point, that yes, we know what we're up against, and we know that it's not just Israel, and we know it's the US and the UK, and all of in terms of the political level globally, we know the enormity of, the quote unquote, the enemy in this instance. But we also know that we have been the main bloc on the ground in terms of allowing Israel to achieve its full objective when it comes to Zionism. So, what are your thoughts on that? Give some. How cool are we? No?
Well, I mean, the reality is that out of 12 million people who live between the river and the sea, about about 7 million are Palestinians. So the Palestinians are the majority of the population. And the vast majority, Palestinians have been resisting in a variety and very, creative ways, mostly unarmed, by the way. And so I think that's, I mean, there's no way, certainly that Palestinians deserve to be commended for this, and they've shown an incredible ability to sacrifice and incredible, creativity in the ways in which they resist. But I think they paid enough. I think Palestinians have paid a heavy price that is far beyond what any nation should have to pay. And so I think, again, it's up to us to stand up and make sure that they don't have to pay anymore. And we're not just talking about Gaza. Palestinians have been living a life of terror for 75 years. There's this impression that somehow the Palestinians in 1948, who have this dubious distinction of having Israeli citizenship, are somehow exempt from this. And if I may, I'll say a word or two about that. People don't realize that citizenship that Palestinians have, those that have citizenship, is nothing like the citizenship that Israelis have, Israeli Jews have. Nothing like it whatsoever. And I'll give you just a couple examples, if I may. So, for example, the Palestinians of 1948 are governed by different agencies. The entire southern part of the country is called Naqab. That's 50%, the southern half of Palestine, is governed by an agency called the Agency for the Development of the Negev. They call it the Negev. The Naqab is Negev in Hebrew. When Israel has an agency that says the development, that means getting rid of Palestinians. That means destroying Palestinian homes, destroying Palestinian lives, and stealing Palestinian land. That's what the word development means. They have the development of the Galilee, the development of Jerusalem, and of course the development. So the Palestinians in the Naqab, some 300,000 Palestinian Bedouin. It's not a small number, who mostly live without access to water or electricity or roads or medical care or jobs or education. Although some miraculously, with all of these obstacles, managed to make it to university, managed to achieve incredible accomplishments. But by and large, this is where they live. And again, that agency has its own law enforcement, which is not, again, it's not law enforcement, it's destruction of homes and stealing of Palestinian land. Now, the Naqab, even though it's a desert, it's a very fertile desert, which is why the Israeli settlements there enjoy some of the highest standard of living among Israelis. And agriculture is very successful there. Now, the Palestinian Bedouin in the Naqab were traditionally farmers, but they're not allowed to engage in farming. Only Israelis are allowed, Israeli Jews are allowed to engage in cultivating the land in the Naqab. If I went back tomorrow, I could have a ranch, subsidized. All the land I want, access to water, I could grow anything I want. The Palestinian Bedouins, whose land this is, are not allowed to engage in agriculture. And this was their tradition. And they talk about Israel having made the desert bloom, particularly when they talk about the Naqab. If you look at aerial photos taken by the British when they occupied Palestine, you will see tracts of cultivated land in the Naqab, cultivated by the Palestinian Bedouin. So it's nonsense. They didn't make anything bloom. They stole a country that was in full bloom, just to make that clear. And I'll just say this, I know that Francesca Albanese was here recently. She's a good friend, she's a wonderful person, of course. And she wrote co-authored an incredibly important document a few years ago, and it's titled Palestinian Refugees in International Law. It's a very, academic book, but it's really very, very important to read. I wrote a review, a pretty long review a few years ago when it came out. And one of the things she details in that book is what was stolen from Palestinians. And I'm just going to say this, I know it's not exactly answering your question, but I think it's important. So, we know the Palestinians' homes were stolen, land was stolen, but what this book also mentions is things that people don't think about. Entire cities were stolen. Entire cities were already there that Israel stole. Jaffa and Haifa and Akka and Tabariya and on and on and on and on and on. Jerusalem, of course, Askelan, and on and on and on. Cities, entire cities. So, public spaces were taken. People had money in the bank. That was taken. Whatever, vehicles, agricultural equipment, the produce. Palestine was exporting citrus, Jaffa oranges, barley from the Nakba, cotton, olive oil, soap, and on and on and on. It was a thriving economy, a thriving culture, a thriving country. It was all stolen, which is one of the reasons Israel was able to function as a state very quickly after it was established. All of this was stolen. They didn't make anything bloom. They stole a country in full bloom. And then they said that they made it bloom. So I think it's important to put that in context. So again, going back to the Palestinians, the citizens of Israel, they're the ones who ended up remaining in that part of the country, what is known today as Palestine of 1948. So it's Palestine without the West Bank and Gaza. And so again, half the country is governed by this other agency, and let me give you some numbers in terms of home demolition, for example. Over the last 5 years, there have been between 10 and 12,000 homes in the Nakba alone demolished. Now, there are many Israeli communities in Nakba. Like I said, they enjoy some of the highest standard of living. How many of those homes would you imagine were the homes of Israeli Jews that built illegally or without a permit? Anybody want to guess? Yeah. None. Now, does that mean Israelis never built without a permit? No. I know Israelis that built without a permit. They had a balcony and they made it into a room. If an inspector finds out that this happens, the authorities find out, they send an inspector, he writes a report, maybe there's a fine, so then they go to court. The court takes years and years and years. Maybe they have to, pay a larger fine, whatever. You never, ever see the Israeli military, the Israeli police close down a street and demolish a home of an Israeli Jew. Ever. Between 2,000 and 2,500 homes demolished in the Nakba alone. 40,000 home demolition orders in the rest of the country, not including Jerusalem or the West Bank. And many Palestinian friends of mine who have home demolition orders will tell me, it's almost worse to have the demolition order than having your home demolished because you don't know when they're going to come and do it. They might come tonight at 2 o'clock in the morning and destroy your home. You never know. A very good friend of mine, a wonderful activist in the city Lid, maybe you know her, Fidash Khadeh. She's a member of the Lid City Council. She grew up in this environment and decided to study city planning because she realized there is no planning for the Palestinian cities inside 1948 and in what's known as the mixed cities, like Akka, like Lid, and others, where you have Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. The only planning is for the Israeli neighborhoods. Nothing for the Palestinians. Nothing. So she went to, God bless her, she's a wonderful, brave woman. So she went and studied, and now she's trying to bring about change, and she's a thorn in their side. But, this is the law, and the lives of Palestinians in 1948, and correct me if I'm wrong, is governed by the Israeli intelligence services, by the Shabak. They can't take a step, they can't get a job. No one can become a teacher or a principal of a school without an okay from the Shabak. The Israeli Ministry of Education has a security department. Israeli teachers don't have to go to the security department. You know what the security department is for? For the Palestinian citizens of Israel who want to become a teacher. And I'll say one more thing about this. I can talk about it all day, but I'll say one more thing. That Israel passed a law where public institutions are not allowed to recognize the Nakba. And in one particular school, and I heard this from a principal in Jerusalem, a teacher wore a kufiyah on May 15th, which is Nakba Day, wore a kufiyah to school. The next day, the principal received a call from the security department inside the Ministry of Education telling him that teacher needs to be reprimanded. The next day. So of course he had to call all the teachers and reprimand all the teachers and so on and so forth. This is the citizens of Israel. The Palestinians who have the citizenship of Israel. This will never happen to an Israeli Jew. So this is the reality. Why is it apartheid? This is apartheid. People ask, no, it's not apartheid, it's a democracy. The stories can go on and on and on how it's not. Yeah.
Thank you. I love talking about 1948, obviously as a 1948er. But just to that point, in which how Amnesty International put together a brilliant report that details all the ways in which Israel practices the crime of apartheid against all Palestinians, not only the ones in Gaza and Ghazi in the West Bank, but also in 1948, as well as the ones in the diaspora. But I think, Miko, now to the question of this.
No, there was not. It was a big question.
No, these are not the question. But but when people found out that you're coming, I've had many friends sending me texts and reaching out, like, Nura, you have to ask him this question, including like my cousins in Germany and Denmark. Please ask him this question. So people want to know, Miko. So you were born in Jerusalem. You grew up in Mutzailit. Done my research. Your grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and your father was a general in the Six-Day War in 1967. And here you are. What happened? So I guess, how did that happen? So what happened and how? Because my other part of the question is, how can we, or do you think it's possible to extend that kind of journey that you went through onto others in Israel?
It's called the sins of our fathers, right? It is possible. There's no question it's possible. I don't think I did anything that's impossible, not even remotely. It's absolutely possible.
I would say it's not that easy. I grew up in,
It's not easy.
Not that easy.
And there are other examples here of people who've done that, who've taken that journey. But well, the short answer to that is, well, that's why there's a book called The General Son. But I'll give you an answer anyway. So yes, I was born in this very, very privileged, very Zionist, patriotic family, as many Israelis are. But in my case, there's so many members of my family that were part of this generation that established the state of Israel, and then we're part of the actual governing of the state of Israel in the first few decades, and of course my father, the general. And so I grew up in this atmosphere where Zionism was like God, and the state was everything. I had a great uncle who was a president, and we would all gather at the president's residence, every year, and the whole family came, and all these important people were part. There's nothing beat the general because he comes with his uniform, and it's the coolest. But nothing beats that. But I mean, everybody around, and the state was like this thing that you sacrificed for and you worked for, and it was just a big deal. It's kind of semi-fascist, really. But as a boy, you grow up and you think, wow. And then there's a break, and the break doesn't come all at once. It's gradual, and that's why again I said there's a book. The journey of an Israeli in Palestine is a long one, even though geographically it's a very short one. And the break in something that is so fundamental, I think sadly only happens as a result of something terrible. You need to be shaken up. You need to be shaken up so severely that it forces you to look at the very fundamentals of who you are and what you believe, and then question them. Which again, is never easy, but in my case, it's the foundation of Israel was so part of who I was and what my family was about that it was very, very difficult. In my case, this terrible tragedy was my 13-year-old niece was killed in a suicide attack in 1997, so a very long time ago. And that's exactly exactly the kind of horror that forces you to re-examine the foundations on which you stand and which make up who you are. This is exactly the kind of thing. And well, I'll say two things about it. Number one, when you carry a small coffin of a child to its final resting place, it's an experience you know you should dedicate your life to make sure this never happens to anyone ever again. That's the kind of experience that is. You can't imagine the horror. And the other thing is, you know, we've become so accustomed to talk about violence when we talk about Palestine that we say, oh yeah, there was suicide bombing, 10 people were killed, and then we move on to something else. And what I like to say is, let's pause for a minute, okay? This was a long time ago, and many, many, many thousands of Palestinian deaths ago, and many Israeli deaths as well. But let's pause for a minute. What actually happened? 3 young men took their lives. 3 young men decided to take their lives and take the lives of others in the process. Wow, what are we talking about? What kind of reality did Israel create that brought about this horror, something so terrible? This is horrifying. This is horrifying. And again, I think part of the problem is that we talk about it and we move on. I'm saying, no, we're not going to move on. Let's talk about this. And the only way to talk about this is to be engaged. So my response or my reaction was to find a way to be engaged. So I was living in the US at the time. I was, back home for the funeral and the whole thing, and then I went back and what do? Everything's changed. You can't just go back to work like nothing happened. I mean, what do? I lived in San Diego in Southern California. Nobody wants to talk about Palestine, and much less talk about something like this, because people don't know how to respond, they don't know how to react. I was extremely, extremely fortunate that eventually, and it took a couple of years, I was able to connect with the Palestinian community in Southern California, and particularly in San Diego. And at that time, there were these, it was very popular for dialogue groups. They were called living room dialogue groups, Jewish Palestinian. And people would meet in each other's homes once a month and not discuss the politics, not argue and so on, but everybody just tells their story. And that was the first time I met Palestinians. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. There are a lot of Palestinians in Jerusalem. I never met them, any of them. I was in the United States the first time I met Palestinians. And then you sit there and you hear these very fine people talk, and they're telling you that night is day and day is night, and that the world is flat. I mean, that's the extent of what they were telling me when I compared it to what I knew to be true. And I had to know what was true because my family was involved, so obviously what I knew was true. And they're telling me that, again, night is day and day is night. So it's a process, and you have to insert a lot of trust. And the reason I said I was so fortunate is because that community was generous and kind enough to allow me to make that very painful journey from where I was to where I am today. And I was compared to like a child learning to walk, where they hold on to something and then they have to let go and walk to the next thing that they can hold on to. And for me, that was exactly it. I had to let go of what I absolutely knew to be true and was a big part of my identity. It was actually the biggest part of my identity. And then walk somewhere and find my identity somewhere else. And an understanding of who I was and how could everything I know to be true turn out to be not true and so on. And that was the process. And then, I began to engage in Palestine itself, and I would go to Palestinian cities, first inside 1948 and then the West Bank, and engage with Palestinians more and more. And the journey is, once you go beyond a certain point, it's a point of no return. So then I had to make a choice. Do I remain, I suppose, loyal to this background that I have, or do I follow my values? Because if I follow my values, I have to reject Zionism, because Zionism is a racist ideology that brought about a great deal of violence and suffering to another people. So eventually that was the that was the route that I chose. I couldn't but reject Zionism. I couldn't but reject that entire history because it's you know, the injustice and so on. So that was the journey, and that's how I ended up, you know, where I am today.
Thanks, Miko. Thank you for sharing. Last question before we open the floor, you know, to take questions from the audience is, you know, you lived obviously in Israel and Palestine in 1948, and you lived in Japan for a while, and you were based in the US. So my question is, what would be lessons learned for global movement for justice for Palestine that you would kind of say that the Australian movement can learn from? Maybe are there any lessons that we can take from, say, and look, knowing that the context is different to the US, obviously different histories, but also both movements are on different stages. But what would be a helpful lesson that we could potentially apply here in Australia?
Well, I don't know that I know more about that than people sitting in this room. And I don't think that the differences are that great between Europe and here and the United States. I don't think the differences are great. I think we're all facing the exact same challenges. And that is, like I said before, the people in the halls of power are not listening to us. And even though we consume the press is not representing us at all. And that is our challenge. We need to close that gap between what we believe and what they do, and between what we do and what they report. It's like we don't exist. And so that is a challenge that I see in every place I've ever been to. All over Europe, all over the United States, here for the second time, in New Zealand, I mean, anywhere I've been, this is the exact same challenge. And people always, every country I go to, every city I go to, people say, this is the worst. The press here is absolutely the worst. The government here is absolutely Zionist. Well, it's everywhere. And we're all facing the exact same challenge. I think that there's a lesson here, and I don't think I'm saying here anything that everybody else hasn't figured out already, and that is we have to work together, and we have to create a strategy, and then we have to fight for an absolute free Palestine, no compromises, 100%, from the river to the sea, a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, and we have to be very, 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 very disciplined. That is the message. Don't talk to me about two-state solution. Don't mention Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel. It's Palestine, it has to be free and democratic.
Woohoo!
So we'll open the floor for questions. Miko takes 3 questions at a time. But please, can I just remind everyone to be concise and short with the questions, but also make sure you're asking a question, not just a statement. Please raise your hand, and obviously, maybe state your name. Just let us know your name before you quickly. And apologies, but I will need to intervene if I think that the question is taking a little longer. So apologies in advance, but I will interject. So. Thank you.
I'm Fatima. My question to Miko is that I heard that you're working in out of Washington as well to set up voices and to bring about change. So do you think, we've recently heard that Joe Biden say if there was no Israel to protect US interests, we would have to create Israel, and that was widely circulated. He's held his position for a long time. Given that the Middle Eastern states of today are more modern and open and willing to cooperate with the US and UK, do you think in the future US will still need an Israel to protect its interests in the Middle East?
Great question. Yeah.
Look, just apologise. It's not a question. It's just a brief announcement. What I do, the way I promote Palestine is I printed leaflets, and I believe this leaflet will be the people.
We need questions. Any announcements?
So basically, what I'm just saying is.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Peace, brother.
Thank you. And up here, you say we have to make demands and not negotiate. What would be the kinds of direct action that would make refusing to acquiesce to the demands too expensive?
Hello, my name is Hisham. I have a question about what your thoughts would be for a very young anti-Zionist movements that we are seeing in the U.S. right now, with Jewish people for peace. I think, why is it easier for younger Jewish people in the U.S. right now to identify the policies of the Zionist ideologies compared to their parents? Sorry, I'm just nervous.
Doing well, brother.
Would intergenerational trauma come into play between the different generations in terms of their loyalty to the Zionist ideology?
Thanks. Okay, it's 3 questions, so we'll let Miko answer and then we'll move to the...
Okay, the first question is great. They're all good questions, so thank you. But this question is really important. You know, this whole idea that somehow Israel is needed for U.S. interests or Western interests in the Middle East, that sort of thing, you know, I don't think it's true. I mean, let's say tomorrow Palestine was free and democratic. Why would they not be working with the U.S. or, the U.S. has great allies, as allies in Egypt, in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf, in most of North Africa. Why does it need Israel in particular? You know, if Palestine was free and democratic, I'm sure they'd still be happy to receive $4 billion a year. Hopefully they won't use it to buy arms, they'd use it to do something productive. But I mean, I think it's nonsense. I think it's absolute nonsense, and I'm glad you asked the question because I think you see that too. But no, it's a ridiculous claim. It's part of this Zionist propaganda that somehow the world needs Israel because Israel is this wonderful, miraculous thing. But it's absolute nonsense. I agree with you. I don't think it's needed at all. To talk about how to make basically the occupation of Palestine costly is, I think, what you're asking. And I have a great friend who's a remarkable hero. His name is Isa Amro, and he operates in Al-Khalil, in the city of Hebron. He runs what is probably the most important and most effective grassroots resistance organization in Palestine. And he himself is an icon. I respect him greatly. I follow him into fire. And he always says, we have to make it costly. We have to make it costly. Well, how do you make it costly? Sanctions. Boycott. Divestment. You may have heard the acronym before, BDS. That is how you make it costly. Now, the thing is, I think sanctions are clear. We know what sanctions are, okay? We've seen, the West, led by America, impose sanctions on every country they don't like, right? So we know what sanctions are like. It actually strangles the country economically and diplomatically. Divestment again is quite clear. I think there's a misunderstanding about the boycott. I think that people think, and it's not wrong, but they think that the boycott means don't buy Israeli avocados or oranges or something, and you shouldn't. But boycott means that Israeli teams are prohibited from participating in the Olympics, which means there should be no presence for Israelis in any arena.
That's right.
If you held an event and you invited a South African team during apartheid, you would be penalized as an organization. Whether, again, it's a sporting event, academic event, cultural event, on and on and on. Certainly diplomatic arenas, there should be no representation. It should be absolutely, there should be absolutely no tolerance for that. You know, and some of you may remember, I always mention this because I think it's important. In the 2021 Olympics in Japan, there was an Algerian athlete by the name of Fathi Nourim. And he was a competitor in judo. And he was a young man, I don't know, 20, 22. And you know how hard somebody has to work before they can enter the Olympics. You have to be incredibly, disciplined and work very hard for many years. And during the Olympics, he was called on to compete against a member of the Israeli team. And he said no. He wouldn't do it. He was thrown out of the Olympics. He was thrown out of the International Judo Federation, which means he cannot participate in judo competition anywhere. Anywhere. He ended his career. He sacrificed his career to do the right thing. And personally, as somebody who has experience in martial arts, he won the match without even stepping on the mat. There's no question that he won that match. But he should not have to make that sacrifice. The International Olympic Committee should not allow an Israeli team into the Olympics to begin with. It shouldn't be up to a young person, a young athlete, to sacrifice a career. And this is true, in every arena. We hear stories like this, refusal to engage with an Israeli delegation, with an Israeli team, which is wonderful, it's heroic, it's the way it should be. But it's not up to individuals to make the sacrifice. Institutions need to make the sacrifice. That's where the boycott is important. That's what we must demand. And again, I'll say, sporting events, cultural events, diplomatic events, academic arenas, for sure, they should not be allowed to enter. In the US, and I'm sure it's the same here on campuses, you've got whatever the mascot is, blah, 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 for Israel. And I'm thinking, are you out of your minds? You're allowing a group that promotes racism and violence to have representation on campus? And then the administrations always give a hard time to the pro-Palestinian groups who call for justice and freedom. You know what I mean? That's what boycott is. And when we get serious about Israel paying, that's how you make them costly. That's how you make them pay a price. That's the price they need to pay. And when you do that, that's what brings them to their knees. And then we can bring about change. That's what needs to happen. I think that one of the stories was the famous story that I think it was in New Zealand. They were not allowed to participate in rugby or something with the South Africans, and that tore us in New Zealand apart politically. But that was the decision that had to be made. You cannot make any compromise on this because they have to pay a price. And in the end, like I said before, this is what's going to be beneficial for Palestinians and for Israelis, because that's the way to peace. That's the only way to peace. So that's how you make it costly. I don't know, the question about the young anti-Zionist Jews. Anti-Zionist Jews have been around for a very long time, and they've been speaking out for a very long time. Nobody's been listening. Now, with these very active young Jewish organizations that have been around and have been protesting, people are paying attention. But it's not really new, and I don't think it's generation. There are many older anti-Zionist Jews around in the US and everywhere else. But I don't think they've been given the platform, and I don't think they know how to use the platform as well as these young people. So that's what we're seeing. I'm not sure that this is somehow a departure from a generational thing, because I know many older anti-Zionist Jews that have been active for a very long time. Many of them are, the most observant Orthodox Jews in the world that live in the United States. They are the most consistent anti-Zionists in the world, actually. They've been anti-Zionists from the very beginning. And so it's great that people are paying attention, but I don't think it's easier for them or anything like that. I just think that they know how to use the platforms that are available to make their voices heard.
Thank you. I'm one of those non-Zionist Jews who's been involved since the early 70s. I've also read some of your... I've been reading your stuff, but also your sister's. And your sister actually does present very good arguments about the whole racist nature of the Israeli education system, which basically objectively puts forward Palestinians as the enemy other. And we can see this, what is happening in Gaza right now, and which is a genocidal war, clearly. I think what we've got to do now is to build up a really critical mass. And I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I'm feeling right now that this is what is happening throughout the world. That the critical mass is building up, where the Israeli regime is going to be non-acceptable amongst other nations. So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Aisha. You mentioned around the work that you're doing in Washington, and I guess that's around building political capacity of people, do you know what I mean, to stand up and to advocate for Palestine on the political scene. My question is, how do we keep Palestine in the forefront if we're thinking, you know, we're talking about politicians, and that it isn't lost in, you know, in cost of living? So I think about the Australian, you know, the Australian political scene. People are passionate, but when it comes to getting ready to vote, whether or not that's state or federal, it's around, you know, cost of living, it's around, you know what I mean, the money, what's impacting, what's the government going to give me, when we're thinking around tax breaks and all of that sort of stuff.
Miko, it's absolutely a pleasure seeing you here in person, so welcome to Australia. I've written the question, it's quite long, but there's been talks, so it's into the details of what you've discussed today. There's been talks on the media around a second ethnic cleansing plan for the Gazans into neighboring countries. What are your thoughts on that? And if it's true, to what extent do you think the Palestinian resistance in Gaza played a role in thwarting these plans? On top of that, I just want to pile another question, if I may. Why do you think it is a taboo in the West to objectively and analytically discuss the legitimacy of the Palestinian resistance, including the armed struggle against apartheid? And how do you think we can break that taboo?
Great question. Yeah.
Just do one more. The first one was a comment, so we can do that.
Thank you so much. My name is Mahek, and thank you for sharing your thoughts thus far. Would love to know from your experience of watching the global movement, how we activate diaspora communities to understand the fallacies of Israel who are removed from the issue. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous as well. For instance, Australia has a lot of new migration waves in the last few years. I am one of those as well. And I can speak, for instance, with the South Asian diaspora who come to mind. We have large migration waves, but the narrative is almost completely absent from those community spaces. So I'm curious to understand how it is that we start to activate diaspora outside of maybe even faith spaces, because I know that faith is often used as a rhetoric. So how do we make it more secular as a dialogue so that other communities can be involved?
Okay, well, you don't pull any punches. These are good questions. These are good questions today. How do we keep Palestine in the forefront is probably one of the biggest challenges with one question, because everybody wakes up and when Palestinians are being killed, and then, or after the Palestinians are being killed usually, and then everybody goes back home. And that's exactly the problem I was discussing earlier, that the void of an actual Palestinian, presence that continues this conversation all the time. So I was talking to a young Palestinian who was an intern in the office of one of the senators in Washington, D.C. And he was telling me that they receive 300 emails a day from a single Zionist organization called Stand With Us. 300 emails a day, every senator, every member of Congress, probably the press as well. I wouldn't be surprised if they send it to the diplomatic corps. Every single day, and that's just one of many Zionist organizations that operate in the United States. That's how you keep it in the forefront. That's how you do it. Now, the problem is we're not there. They're 100 years ahead of us. We're not there. We don't have the presence to do that. It requires presence, it requires training, it requires a strategy, it requires money. There's no shortage of money out there that could be dedicated to this, but it's just not happened yet. That's what it takes. That's precisely why their story is always on the forefront. It doesn't matter what Israel does, what Israel doesn't do, it's always on the forefront. It's IHRA, the new definition of anti-Semitism, is swept like a wildfire. It's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. Redefining anti-Semitism. What will they think of next? But it was brilliant. There's not a single governmental and non-governmental organization, not a single university, church, I don't know what, that didn't pass it. Cities and city councils and regional council. Everybody's passing this nonsense. Because nobody's really sure what the hell's going on, so they say, well, let's pass it because it's safe. There was a case near Washington, D.C., in Maryland, a county called Montgomery County. The county passed a resolution, and so and they do it in secret. They do it in the middle of the night, so there won't be any opposition. So the word got out, and so it was blocked. A few weeks later, we woke up one morning, and we learned that it passed. They met, I don't know, in the middle of the night in a dungeon basement or something, and they passed it. That's how they do it. But they are constantly present and they're constantly pushing their agenda. And they're constantly thinking of new ways to keep it up on the forefront. That's how you do it. That's how you do it. There's no other way to do it. So I hope we can, like I said, this initiative that I'm working on in Washington is to do exactly that. I know there's people working here in Australia to do that sort of thing. That's how you do it. We're never going to get beyond where we are unless we can do that. The ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and I think what the Palestinian resistance did. I'll start with the end of the question. How to start legitimizing the Palestinian resistance and discussion about it. Well, we legitimize it by saying it. Every interview I've given, and I've given I don't know how many since October 7th, and every lecture I've given, somewhere in the mix, there's always the question about. I'm sorry? I never mentioned Hamas. I never mentioned Hamas. Why do I care if these fighters are a member of this party or that party or this group? They're Palestinian fighters. You think they belong to somebody? They're not armed groups, they're not all the different names they used to. These are Palestinian fighters. That's it. I'm not going to get into that conversation. But you condemn, you condemn somebody? I condemn the brutal violence by Israel for 75 years, absolutely. You need to condemn You want to condemn and oppress people for resisting? Are you out of your mind? Who condemns and oppresses people for resisting? What is this nonsense? But we have to take control of the conversation and not let them dictate what we say or don't say. So I think part of the problem is that people are ill-equipped, and it's not because of anybody's fault. I do this every day, all day. Not everybody, does that, and so not everybody's equipped for this, and they have a playbook. So, like I said, a few days ago, I was at a campus in the U.S. and I heard this, river to the sea thing. Yesterday, I was in Adelaide. I heard the same thing. Boom, like that in 5 minutes. It's done. The playbook is everywhere, and everybody knows what to ask, what to say, what to condemn, what to not condemn, and on. And we're like, okay, well, how do we say this, and how do we deal with that? And it's legitimate, but we need guidance, and we need an organization, and we need a platform that will help us do that. So, but the way we legitimize talking about it is by talking about it. Is by saying it just the way, just the way it is. And it's not easy, and it's not comfortable. And if you're working in a workplace, it's dangerous. And if you're a teacher, you're gonna get threatened. And if you're this and that and the other, there are a lot of risks, and you pay a price. But silence is also a price. And the price of silence is paid by the Palestinian children who are buried under the rubble. That's the price of our silence. And we have to keep that front and center. We have to keep thinking about that. And that's what's going to get us to where we need to be. I think what the Palestinian resistance on October 7th did thwart is the normalization talks. Even the Saudi foreign minister immediately said, okay, everything's on hold now, And so they did, I think, a lot more than they ever thought I don't know what they thought, but I don't think they imagined that they would have such an impact. So definitely, but I think it's important to talk about it in a way that shocks the other side. And when I say these things, by the way, about the Palestinian fighters, the other side is like in shock. They're in shock. There's like the silence and confusion, and that's precisely what they need to be. And by the way, if they're also offended by this, then that's extra credit. That's good. How to get this conversation into communities that are already weak, and I think that's what you're talking about, immigrating, communities of immigrants, if I'm not mistaken. That's a really difficult one, because they're already vulnerable. And for vulnerable communities to get involved in something that is this difficult and complicated is a tough call. Now, having said that, I know in the United States it is happening, and people are getting involved, and people are speaking, and young people are doing it even though the parents don't want them to, and so on. And you're also right that in many communities, especially if they're South Asian or Arab, then in many cases it's Al-Aqsa. It's the religious thing that draws them in, and I think it's a fair concern. In terms of access to the religious sites and the existence of the religious Muslim sites and Christian, for that matter, in the Holy Land in Palestine, they are under threat. There's no question. The Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron is already half of it's been taken, and settlers come and go, and the soldiers come and go into the Muslim part of it freely whenever they want. Palestinians sometimes don't even have time to roll up the rugs before they walk in with their dirty boots into the mosque. Al-Aqsa, there's what's called the Hebronization of Al-Aqsa. In other words, the same process where they allow the settlers more and more into the holy space is exactly happening now. Not to mention other places throughout Palestine. So this is a serious concern, and I think it's a good thing that people get involved, on that issue too. The problem with that is that it's, I don't know how to say this properly, you need to have a political element in that as well. It can't just be the religion, because the problem is the politics. The problem is that Israel allows itself to do this, and this is a political issue. So, but again, having vulnerable communities to delve into this, I think they're courageous when they do, but I can't blame them when they don't. And again, I've never been in that position of vulnerability, so I can't really tell people what to do or not to do when they're in that position. I think, yeah.
Thank you. There's something that I would like to address. I think a few questions were raised in terms of what is it that we can do, and how can we basically, get Palestine to burst out of the Palestine bubble. And I think that these are questions that are really important to tackle. But in terms of what actually can do, how can we keep Palestine, and that's something that you mentioned as well in your answer, Miko, how can we keep it up front and center? But just to give kind of practical steps that you can do. So the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, APAN, has set up campaigns for people to actually send letters to their political leaders and MPs. So that's one, tangible thing that you could actually do, is that you could send those letters to your politicians and keep sending those letters, keep calling them, keep trying to kind of, request that you meet, and keep up the pressure. So there are actually actions that you could do, something that has been set up by organizations, advocacy organizations. So check out EGPAN's website. The other thing that I want to address, and that's the question I think that was raised over there in terms of how can we, but also building on Miko's answer, how can we get Palestine to get out of the bubble that is limited to Palestine and get as many other groups as possible involved. And I think intersectionality is a key. We know that settler colonial projects and oppressive regimes support each other. We know that for a fact. But we also know that the answer to counter that, and that's something that we've been doing successfully to a certain extent, but also obviously there's continuous work that needs to be done in that space. And the answer to counter that is to build a cross-national or international solidarity movements, such as the global movement for justice for Palestine that we're seeing, and that in the last couple of months we've seen the enormous numbers, millions and millions around the world coming out, and every weekend in our rallies we have such a diverse crowd. Right, we're having looking at the crowd, like it's people from different backgrounds. We have different flags as well raised to kind of highlight the diversity of the supporters. So I think it's happening. We just need to kind of keep pushing in that direction. It's really important to keep finding those links. And Miko mentioned one of them is the Islamic kind of link to the cause. And clearly that's one important link or intersection, but there's also heaps of other intersections that we can build on, and we should continue to build on and extend and expand those networks. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah. So one more round. Last 3 questions, and then that's it. Just realizing that we're quite grossly over time.
Thank you, Miko. My name is Rami. I'm from Palestine, from Jenin camp. Actually, I have 2 quick questions. The first one is that you have talked about the dismantling of the apartheid regime system, the Israeli apartheid regime system. To what extent do you agree that the Palestinians in Israel should stop participating in the Knesset election? That's my first question. My second is, you may hear about the barbaric attack on Jenin camp right now. About 11 people have been killed until this afternoon. So do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu are trying to turn his focus to West Bank as he's stuck in Gaza? That's my question.
Thanks, Miko. I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask the main one that applies to us here. You, as an anti-Zionist Jew, you can say these things without being accused of being anti-Semitic. But as an Arab, it's not as easy, and I have come across a lot of what you've discussed, where I felt like this is really frustrating. Even the language, even describing the situation, I have to fight the monopoly over language. I cannot say genocide without, oh, you can't use this word. I can't say, like anything that remotely expresses what's actually happening, we can't use because we might alienate the community, and we're trying to build support from the Jewish community. And so I've recently had to deal with, you can't say that. Let's not use that term. So what would you suggest? Do we confront, or do we water it down to gain support? And, I don't mind just one last thing, short of having
12 million home visits, how do we actually impact the Jewish community in Israel to convert them to anti-Zionist Jews? Because it's not going to work otherwise.
Don't water down anything.
Hi, Miko. My name is Dana. I'm Palestinian from Bethlehem. So
Woohoo!
question about the unfolding genocide happening now in Gaza. We have seen a lot of investigative reports reflecting on the economic motives behind the genocide to level Gaza down, to create a water canal, to replace the Suez Canal. But do you think that the Zionist ideological motive kind of prevails over the economic motive here, or are they the same, or is it the economic motive that kind of prevails in this genocide? Thank you.
You've been working.
Hi. I guess my question is basically around October 7 and Israel's reaction. I've been involved in Palestine solidarity stuff for 55 years.
Woohoo! Yes!
Always found it very difficult, obviously, because you come across people like that you work with who supported Tibet, supported the South African black struggle, even the American Indians, and you. One night at work, I was talking to a friend about Palestine, and so this person that supported all those things came in and said, I won't support Palestinians because they're too violent. And of course, I said, go away and look at the history. You will see that they used all sorts of, struggle for their struggle. And it's always been a problem, this exceptionalism with Israel, the exceptionalism of the Palestinians. I found that it's evaporated recently. And I reckon it's a similar thing to what happened in the Vietnam War. The Americans arrogantly went in, thought they'd take a few weeks, and there was this television war that showed all these massacres, 4 million Vietnamese dead, and the Americans lost the war. Do you think, a few friends of mine have said, that they thought that Netanyahu knew that October 7 was going to happen. He let it happen because it helped him. I said, look, I say that could have been the reason, but I reckon it's stupidity and arrogance, the same sort of thing that happened with Vietnam. What do you think?
Rami, I'm going to answer your question. I hope you don't mind. I think, first of all, you're from Jenin. I have my family in Jenin as well. I hope your family is safe currently, given everything. So I grew up in Akka, and I have always been politically active. And a big part of my political activism in Akka was also through political parties who are Palestinian political parties, such as Tajammu'ad and National Democratic Assembly, and others. So the part of your question where you ask about whether it is actually beneficial, and would it be beneficial for Palestinians to boycott the Israeli election? So I think, obviously the answer is never straightforward, right? Because we know that the goal or the aim of Israel and the occupation, or the ways in which the occupation manifests, is not just by land grab and land theft and all that stuff, but there's another social element, and also it's a consciousness fight, right? It's a fight. It aims to also dilute your identity as a Palestinian. Suddenly you're not a Palestinian, but you're an Arab Israeli. Suddenly it's not Akka, it's Akko, and all of those kind of that very familiar attempts at erasure. Which is very aggressive, and we experience it on a very aggressive level in 1948. So 1948ers are not only subjected to the kind of like constitutional or like the official, legislative aggression and violence of the Israeli state, but also the Israeli society as well. So there's 2 levels to that. And then the question becomes, would it be helpful if people boycotted, or there were no actually Palestinian parties in the Knesset? And that's a question that we're constantly grappling with. Every elections, there's this question: what do we do? Do we actually participate or do we boycott? Now, the value of having political parties in the Knesset is mainly to speak to Palestinians. They don't go there, like Hanin Zorbi never went there to actually speak to Netanyahu or to the Israeli public. But Hanin Zorbi, for instance, or Azmi Shara went there to speak to the Palestinians because it is a war on our identity. It's they're there to talk about Nakba. They're there to talk about the ongoing ethnic cleansing. They're there to talk about all the permits that we're not allowed to have and all the houses that are being demolished. But really, people don't know that this is happening because Israel is, it's great at kind of hiding those facts. So I think it's a fair question, and that's something that we're constantly reevaluating. Every election, what do we do now? Do we participate or do we not participate? But I think given recently and how the shift in, which is quite actually embarrassing, the shift with regards to how the political, some of the political parties have been, and their attempt to kind of integrate, such as, Mansour Abbas. We're not related, it's just the same names, by the way.
Why I ask this question? Because the Israeli, because the Israeli side used this participation to legitimize this apartheid system. We actually, all of us know that the Israeli is apartheid system.
Yes,
and
I know your point. It's the fig leaf, right? Isn't it? So
yeah,
this is what
we
they
are
go.
talking about as an apartheid system. They claim that we have Palestinians
participating in the electoral process. But this is a very superficial understanding of what democracy is, isn't it? Like if you claim that there was also elections in Egypt. So I think the fact that you have elections does not necessarily mean that you have democracy, and that's what we need to tackle. But I think the political, and look, this is a role that political parties could potentially also play outside of the Knesset, right? In terms of that awareness raising and pushing that narrative that is the indigenous Palestinian population. But just to answer that question, so I don't know if we have a straightforward answer to that. I think it's something that we're constantly evaluating. Sorry, listen, I'm very...
No, I think you're in a much better position to answer that question than I am.
Sorry, we covered all the questions. I think now Miko's going to address his.
I think you're much better equipped to answer that question than I am. That's for sure. So I appreciate that. I'll say two things about that from my experience. One is I don't know how they can operate in that. I've been to the Knesset several times, mostly to visit Palestinian members. And it's the most racist, disgusting place I can ever imagine. But I do, and it's not a straight. There's no way to answer that question, clearly yes or no, because there's too many elements. I think the reality is that most Palestinian citizens of Israel actually do boycott and don't vote. But when I see Ahmed Tibi, or in the past, speaking Arabic from the podium, and I see the reactions from the Israeli going nuts, I think it's worth it just for that. He reminds them, as they should be reminded, even if they're not really listening, it reminds everybody, and this goes on TV and this goes on social media, that this is Palestine. Yes. And he stands there with his beautiful red flag and so on, and reminds them, this is Palestine, this is his country, this is his language, and there's nothing they can do to change that. And when Hanin Zahabi was in the Knesset too, she drove him crazy and keep reminding them that. So I think there's value in that, but again, I'm not the one that really has the ability to make that judgment. I think the Palestinian citizens of Israel need to make that judgment. As for Jenin, Israel has been scared to death of Jenin for a very long time. All I can say is that we've seen just incredible heroism coming out of Jenin for years now. I have a good friend who's a cartoonist from Jenin. His name is Mohammed Sabani, and he does incredible work, and he's a good friend. And I love his stuff. And some of his cartoons represent that heroism from Jenin better than anybody else I've seen. But I think it's because he's from there. But again, I think Israel has been terrified in attacking Jenin for a very long time. So that's just the reality, because Jenin is a hub of great courage. Let's see. So the second question, whether to confront or water down. I mean, you've heard my talk, I think, right? So I don't know that, I don't think there's any question about where I stand on this issue. Again, I'm not the one who has to suffer the consequences, like the things that you described. However, it's, you know, like I said, silence is a price. And the price of that silence is paid by, you know, the Palestinians being killed. So it's a very tough choice. But as again, a good brother, friend of mine, Bassem Tamimi, says, you know, we expect to pay a price because we stand and resist. And we expect to pay a price. And we expect that our children will pay a price. And his daughter is Ahat Tamimi, she's paid a price, and all of his kids have paid a price as a result of that. So it's a decision that it needs to be made, whether you confront it. And I think it's important to confront it also because how else are they going to know? You know, how else are they going to know that this is racist, that this is wrong? My mother used to say, if you don't tell a fool that they're a fool, they're never going to know. it's, you know, you do pay a price, but I mean, we expect to pay a price when we stand up for something important. Yeah. So one of the stories that came out, and even by serious journalists like Seymour Hersh in Washington, D.C. and others, that somehow the Israelis knew about October 7th, but they let it happen. And it caught on. And I'm thinking, once again, it's part of this incredibly stupid racist perspective that says that if Palestinians were able to do something successfully, Israel had to be pulling the strings. There's no way Palestinians were able to outsmart, outmaneuver, out-strategize, and defeat Israel because they are, you know, intelligent and know how to plan and know how to fight and are courageous and smart enough to do what needs to be done. And I think that's part of that. So I reject that idea. And I actually called Seymour Hersh. Seymour, I don't know if you know who he was. He was, back in the day, he was a brilliant, very important journalist. And I called him and said, what are you talking about? He said, no, I have a source. I have an Israeli intelligence officer who's a source. Well, of course. So I don't buy that. It's like another claim that Israel created Hamas, because if there's a solid, brave, you know, resistance organization, then Israel must have created it. Well, Israel did not create Hamas, okay? You know what I mean? If anybody takes the time to study it, and I have, and I mentioned it in my second book, Injustice, I mentioned Hamas a great deal, then that's also nonsense. But again, this idea, it falls on, you know, very fertile ground because there's already this, you know, this preconceived idea that Palestinians are incapable. So if they did something and they were successful, Israel must have helped them somehow. So I reject it. I don't believe it's true for 1 second. I think it's nonsense. And like I said, you can probably hear my voice about to disappear. So I just want to say thank you again for being here. I want to thank my friend Nasser Bashdi. There's no question that he leads by example, so I'm grateful that he's a good friend and the incredible work he does, and my friend Robert Martin sitting over there. It's been very difficult to keep a straight face sitting over there. And everybody else, I mean, I can't be, you know, I can't thank you enough for organizing this and being here and being part of this conversation, and let's keep working to free Palestine. Thank you.
Free Palestine!
Palestine Melbourne, and the loud
Thanks, guys, for watching. Bye.